So welcome to the 6th in this series of UCL Rare-Books Club events for the summer. I am Tabitha Tuckett and I am Rare Books librarian at UCL Special Collections. And today we are grateful to have Erika Delbecque behind the scenes moderating Zoom, and she is head of Rare Books here at UCL Special Collections. As I said, this is the 6th in the session, and if you'd like to book other sessions in our series, please do so on Eventbrite. Next week, we're going to be looking at the conservation of some early modern manuscripts, commonplace books. But today, we have two speakers who are going to talk in some different sense about collecting. We're going to have Isobel Goodman, who's a volunteer from our Liberating the Collections project, and she's going to be talking about women authors in our collection pre-1750. And we follow that with Jemma Stewart, who was a finalist in this year's Anthony Davis book collecting competition. And she's going to be talking about collecting Victorian flower books as a current collector. So just before I hand over to Isobel, for those of you who weren't here last week, I'm just going to repeat myself, I'm afraid, to give you some background about what the Liberating the Collections project is, what it's about, and why we've started it here at UCL Special Collections. As many of you know, UCL was founded in the early 1800s, and much of the special collections we have reflect the white, wealthy European 19th century men who very generously donated to our rare book collections and our archive collections. Since then, there has been a tendency to stick to a canon in the curriculum, and that has repeated those characteristics. And so those are the characteristics that's become most visible in our collections. And Erika Delbecque, I mentioned my colleague before, has pointed out that those characteristics relate to almost every item in our Treasures book, which is a wonderful and free online book that I would recommend. Thank you, Erika, that's in the chat now. But we do have, although it's a relatively static collection of rare books, we do have less visible voices and less visible subjects in the collection. We weren't sure exactly what those were and how we can help to promote those. So in 2019, a colleague, Chris Fripp, and I started a very small pilot project looking at women in the collection, women binders, owners, writers, illustrators, and so on. And this was to tie in with an initiative that's been going for some years, a project that started a few years ago at UCL called Liberating the Curriculum. And that was an initiative addressing the issue of an inclusive curriculum. And Erika has put the link to that in the chat now. We also wanted to tie in with UCL's equality, diversity and inclusion policies and initiatives. So after that pilot study, we wanted to expand this because it was successful, and the whole of UCL Library Services was also looking in 2020 at how they can also contribute to these initiatives. We were also stuck for volunteering projects that our volunteers could start to do remotely during the lockdown because of COVID-19. And I'm very grateful to Erika Delbecque for picking this project up and expanding it with all of our colleagues, our rare book cataloguer Harriet Hale, Vanessa Friedman and Liz Laws, who are subject librarians who deal with some rare books, Vicky Price and Sarah Pipkin in our outreach team. We started with rare books because we wanted people to be looking at the detail on the catalogue. So nothing you're going to hear today is completely hidden. It's all on our free, publicly available library catalogue, which is called Explore. And I think Erika can put the link in the chat to that. We had 90 people interested. We took 15 volunteers. We had a number of different strands: race and colour, women, non-mainstream religions, non-European peoples and cultures, same-sex love and design, LGBTQIA plus authors, social deprivation and poverty. But we're going to hear today about the women's strand. And we had our volunteers identify catalogued items looking at printers, binders, illustrators, at writers and perspectives, at subject areas and representations, and at owners. And I would recommend that you keep an eye on our Special Collections blog, because many of our other volunteers who we've not heard from last week and this week will be writing blog posts about their findings. We're just coming to the end of the first phase, so that we'll be evaluating this project over the summer, and we'll publicise the findings later on this year. So I'm going to introduce now Isobel Goodman, and we're incredibly grateful to all the hard work that she's done as one of our volunteers. She's going to look at the women authors pre-1750 that she's identified in our collections. Isobel is currently working at Cambridge University Library, and before that she did an MA in book history at Edinburgh University. She's going on very soon, I think, unless you've already started, Isobel, to be assistant librarian at Gladstone's Library in North Wales. So many congratulations, Isobel, for getting that job. So I'm going to hand over now to Isobel, who is going to share her screen and give her talk. Over to you, Isobel.
Thank you, Tabitha. Okay. So yes, hello. Thank you very much for having me here to talk today. As Tabitha mentioned, I've been involved in the Liberating the Collections project, researching pre-1750 women writers represented in UCL's Special Collections. I was particularly struck by the variety of ways in which women were able to appear in and engage with print culture in this period. My approach to the research was, I sort of began by, away from the UCL catalogue, researching the more recognised names from my own general knowledge, such as Margaret Cavendish, Mary Wortley Montagu and Aphra Behn, and drawing connections with other contemporary writers from them. I then looked at secondary literature, such as Ballister's History of British Women's Writing and MacDowell's Women of Grub Street, as well as databases like the Orlando database, as you can see in the bottom here, of women's writing in the British Isles. And from those, I compiled a list of names to search for on the UCL catalogue. I also thought about the search terms I was using. For example, searching Mrs. In the creator/author field revealed some lesser known examples of women writers. And in my presentation today, I'm going to focus on 4 of these lesser known women writers whose non-aristocratic status provides a fascinating insight into how women interacted with print culture at this time. My first example is Eleanor James. Unusually, Eleanor James was not only a woman writer, but also an author-printer. She is known to have taken over her husband Thomas's printing business after his death in 1710, yet her involvement in the business evidently predated widowhood, since many of her writings, including the example I'm going to be talking about in UCL Special Collections, precede Thomas's death. James was an infamous petitioner, and being both author and printer was key to her ability to do this. Petitioning was central to royal and parliamentary process in the 17th and 18th centuries, with every member of the population theoretically entitled to present petitions directly to the monarch or to members of parliament asking to have their grievances addressed. MacDowell notes that a tradition of female petitioning was well established by James's time, such as wives petitioning to reclaim their husbands' confiscated estates during the English Civil War. Whilst originally handwritten private documents, by the 1640s, when Eleanor James was writing, petitions were being printed in the hope of reaching a wider audience. To avoid appearing to be a premeditated attack on the king or parliament, though, petitions needed to look spontaneous. They needed to be reactionary. For James, her dual writer-printer role perfectly suited this, enabling her to produce pamphlet and broadside petitions almost immediately in response to new laws, debates, or even other pamphlets. Extant explicitly attributed documents indicate that she penned at least 90 pamphlets and broadsides during her career, although the ephemeral nature of these items could disguise a much greater number. And we can see that in this example here. This pamphlet has been bound into a volume of several other pamphlets, and the edges have been trimmed. And at the bottom here, if they'd trimmed the bottom edge, What they've done is they've just folded it up as a flap, but if they'd trimmed it, we'd have lost that imprint, and so we would have lost the sense that she was involved in the publication as well as the writing of this document. So UCL hold this copy of Mrs. James's Vindication of the Church of England from 1687, which, as the full title demonstrates, was in an answer to a pamphlet entitled A New Test of the Church of England's Loyalty. Published anonymously earlier in 1687, this original pamphlet had taken a staunchly anti-Catholic response to James II's Declaration of Indulgence, issued in April of the same year, which granted broad religious freedom in England and permitted worship of any religion at home and in chapels. Eleanor James's response in this pamphlet countered the attacks made in the preceding pamphlet, concluding with "God Save the King" in capital letters. The rapid publication of both pamphlets within the same year as James II's declaration demonstrates the fast-paced, ephemeral and cheap nature of pamphlet production, and suggests that Eleanor James sought neither literary renown nor money through her writings. However, the conspicuous publication of her name on her pamphlets, in this example, often in the title itself, indicates that she wished her part in their writing and printing to be known. This UCL example declares in its imprint, "Printed for me, Eleanor James," and she's used as an italic type for her own name, which confirms her personal voice throughout this text. Indeed, a portrait, this portrait here, gifted by James to Sion College in 1711, along with the gift of her husband's books, portrays her holding a large, lavishly bound book, which has been suggested might have been the donor's book for Sion College, with a copy of her Vindication of the Church of England displayed next to her. And it looks like, to me at least, that is a manuscript title page rather than a print one if we compare the two, interestingly. Without doubt, it was James's intention to present herself publicly as both writer and printer. Another example is Mary Leaper. In the absence of owning a printing press, authors could publish their writings through subscription. Prior to the 18th century, the fee for printing a text had to be paid up front, either personally by the author or via a patron. Subscription printing then developed, whereby a writer would announce the text's imminent publication in hope that potential readers might help fund the printing by paying half of the price in advance and the other half on receipt of the book. The printer would then include a list of these subscribers within the publication itself as a further incentive to these subscribers. The process enabled less wealthy writers to print their works, as demonstrated in UCL Special Collections by the example of Mary Leaper. Hailing from the labouring class, the daughter of a gardener, Leaper worked as a kitchen maid, making her an unexpected candidate for a published author. However, she likely saw the financial potential of printing a volume of her poetry, part funded by subscription, and her ultimate success in securing subscribers was no doubt aided by curiosity of her unique situation. Leaper's friend, Bridget Fremantle, a rector's daughter, and her employers and their relations, the Jennans and Blencos, respectively, also provided useful connections in this quest. Leaper herself died tragically young in 1746, 2 years before the first volume of the book appeared in print to positive reviews. The success of this first volume prompted publication by novelist Samuel Richardson of a second, larger volume compiled from Leaper's surviving manuscripts, of which UCL holds this copy here. While less successful in attracting subscribers, the woodcuts of this anthology suggest some luxury was still within budget. Although she is less known today, Leaper was a well-known poet during her lifetime and in the period after her death. In an anthology of poems by eminent ladies, published in 1755, more pages were devoted to Leaper than to any other writer, including Aphra Behn. Indeed. UCL's copy was previously owned by Jeremy Bentham, and it includes this leaf of manuscript annotations of Mrs. Gray's Memories of Mary Leaper, indicating a prestigious readership of both men and women. And the quotes here are very interesting in that they show that Mary Leaper was somebody that people wanted to be associated with, they wanted to talk about her. So Mrs. Gray claims that she herself was the occasion of Mrs. Leaper being first taken notice of on account of some poems which she had written. And she also claims that she is the one who recommended the young author of them to Miss Bridget Fremantle, a maiden lady of fortune. The final quote here as well demonstrates that not only was Miss Fremantle a generous patroness and benefactress to Mrs. Leaper, and we think that she actually encouraged her to print her poems, she also was sort of materially useful in providing her with pens, ink and paper, and a bureau, bookcase and likewise books, before which she had scarcely an opportunity of coming at any books or the means of procuring them, which again just really emphasises the fact that she was very unlikely to appear in print. She was not someone who necessarily had access or contact with books on a regular basis. My next example is Lucy Hutchinson, and unfortunately I don't have any images of her work, but this is an engraving of her. So Lucy Hutchinson penned a variety of compositions, including poems, petitions, prose works, biography, and translations, all of which remained unpublished during her lifetime. Well, there's a poem that was published anonymously, which has later been attributed to her, but the rest of her work remained just in manuscript form. She is perhaps best known for her memoirs of her husband, John Hutchinson, a signatory of Charles I's death warrant, who died in prison following the restoration of the monarchy. Written between 1665, just after her husband's death, and 1671, Hutchinson claimed the account was to preserve the memory of her husband for their children, and she did not seek to publish this work. This did not prevent it from reaching an audience beyond just her family, though. Manuscripts were often circulated between authors and reader networks at this time, and indeed the introduction to the first print edition attests that it was well known even before its posthumous publication. And the quote says that one of her relatives was frequently solicited to permit them to be published, particularly by the late Mrs. Catherine Macaulay, who was a historian, but had uniformly refused. The memoir's eventual publication raises questions about the control authors had over their writing. Hutchinson intended her personal account to be a naked, undressed narrative, speaking the simple truth of him, which will deck him with more substantial glory than all the panegyrics the best pens could ever consecrate to the virtues of the best men. And her careful handwritten revisions confirmed deliberate control of the manuscript text and a deliberate attempt to craft this text. Yet in 1806, her great-great-grandson Julius published a heavily edited, although well-received, first edition of the work, which was swiftly followed by 2 further editions before 1810. UCL Special Collections hold 5 copies, ranging in date from the second edition of 1808 up to 1904. The editor of the first edition recommended it particularly to female readers as more entertaining than most novels, sort of giving it a moral stamp and a moral use. And the book's moralistic account of the Civil War impacted both historiography and popular opinion, although it's interesting that Hutchinson herself is mostly only mentioned in the context of being a devoted wife rather than a historian, which is something that scholars are continuing to question today. The question remains, was this how Hutchinson herself would have chosen to market her work in print, if at all? My final example is Theresia Constantia Phillips. Theresia Constantia Phillips's life was one of scandal, bigamy, debts, and legal disputes with her husbands. By writing memoirs of her scandalous affairs, copies of which are held in UCL Special Collections, Phillips's original goal may have been more to make money through blackmailing her lovers than from book sales. Her blackmail attempts evidently being unsuccessful, however, she went ahead with the publication. And this is a copy that UCL holds. The imprint of this book at the bottom of the title page here says, NB, such extraordinary care has been taken to intimidate the booksellers in order to stifle this work, that Mrs. Phillips is obliged to publish it herself and only at her house in Craig's Court, Charing Cross, and to prevent imposition, each book will be signed with her own hand. And we can see here, both on the title page and under her portrait, she has signed her name in very big, bold letters, very easy to read. This is interesting, as following the removal of pre-publication censorship during the 18th century, scandalous material could be more easily published in Britain. Trade publishers, such as Mary Cooper, who were willing to assign their own name to the imprint and sell books and pamphlets on behalf of the publisher and copyright holder, further enabled respectable publishers to print controversial works without incurring damage to their reputation. So I find it quite hard to believe that she would have struggled to find somebody to sell this work, especially if it was sort of as salacious as she claims. It seems more likely, therefore, that this imprint on her text was merely a tactic for sales and self-promotion, and it's also an excuse to get people to come and see her in person. So not only are they reading about her, they also get to see and hear from her as she signs their book and gives them a copy herself. Phillips also raises an important point about searching for women authors in these library catalogues. In these 2 copies here, she has signed her name as Phillips, and it's the name as well that appears on the title page. However, her Library of Congress authorised name that would appear in most library catalogues is actually Millman, which was her married name, or one of her married names, which you can see here, the signature or the annotation on this copy of another work associated with her you can see the beginnings of Muilman here, M-U-I-L-M, and then it's been trimmed. Obviously, this is a more prevalent issue for particularly women writers and women book owners and collectors, because their names would be more likely to change when they got married or if they married several times. And so again, that kind of raises issues about how do we go about finding these women in the collections. So in conclusion, whether for money, renown or politics, all of these women represented in UCL Special Collections were able to use authorship to their advantage and their own purpose, albeit with varying degrees of control over the resulting publications. Perhaps the latter issue is more to do with the relationship between authorship and print, however, than with the gender of the author, as there are examples of men's work being published posthumously as well. So how extraordinary were these women writers? The examples here were deliberately drawn from a cross-section of society by way of comparison. Literacy was expanding during the 17th and 18th centuries, and the print market grew greatly after restrictions on the number of printers lifted in 1695. These two factors, combined with an evident interest in matters beyond the household, despite being unable to fight or vote in them, may have created an environment in which women's voices could actively reach a wider audience through the medium of print. Equally, although these women's writings are less known today, they were known and read by their contemporaries. John Dunton, for example, claims that Thomas James was best known for being the husband of Eleanor James, that she-state politician, and Mary Leaper's poems were popular enough to be reviewed in newspapers, and to the extent that Samuel Richardson decided to publish a second volume. This project is therefore not discovering these women from obscurity, but rather bringing them back into the light to be read and appreciated today as they were by their own contemporaries and within that context of their historical readership. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Isobel. That's wonderful. We've got so many interesting items there in our collections that I have to say are not in the past, have not been brought out as much. So I think that's really going to make a big impact to our teaching and our events. Our digitization has already made an impact, and the way that we present our collections. And a huge amount of work. Thank you very much, Isobel, for doing such a fantastic job. So we're going to move on to our second speaker now, and then we'll have questions afterwards. But I know there are some people in the audience who will know a lot about those authors and might be able to join in the discussion. But for now, we're going to move on to Jemma Stewart, who is a collector now in the present day. And Jemma is collecting of Victorian books of flower meanings. Now we're going to hear a little bit more about what that means and about that genre. But Jemma was a finalist in this year's Anthony Davis Book Collecting Prize, and this is a prize that's open to students at any London-based university. And we're very proud to be hosting the prize at the moment. It has previously been hosted by Senate House Library, and I'm sure that there will be many more university libraries in London sharing in this. But for now, we're very proud to be hosting it at UCL Special Collections. I'd like to thank the judges of the competition, who included representatives from the Antiquarian Booksellers Association, from the Bibliographical Society, and from Senate House Library, and of course to give a huge thank you to Anthony Davis himself. If you'd like to hear about other prize, about the winner and the co-winner and the other finalists and winners of this competition this year, just look in the chat and Erika has put the link to the blog post about that. In 2 weeks' time, we're going to be hearing from the winner of this year's competition, who will be talking about women illustrators of the 19th, early 20th century Roycroft press. But back to Jemma. Jemma is studying a PhD in the English department at Birkbeck University, and her PhD is on flower symbolism in Victorian Gothic fiction. And I'm going to hand over to Jemma now. Jemma, over to you.
Thanks, Tabitha. I'll just share my screen. Bear with me one moment. I'd like to thank Anthony Davis too for a start, because putting the entry together for the prize earlier this year was an exercise that just hugely cheered me up, actually. And I want to thank my supervisor as well, Anna Video at Birkbeck, because she introduced me to the language of flowers back when I started my MA at Birkbeck. I think that was around 2013. It feels like a long time ago now. But to begin, I just wanted to give a quick overview of the language of flowers based on really amazing, substantial work by scholars like Beverly Seaton, Brent Elliott, and Jack Goody. So in case anyone is unfamiliar with the language of flowers, it was a 19th century cultural craze and popular publishing fad, allied to the gift book or gift annual. It was an import from France with romanticised Eastern origins and the notion of a codified set of meanings attributed to flowers. So the books were translated, anglicised, and exploded in popularity in Britain and America. Publications of the language of flowers books, whilst fluctuating in style and popularity across really the duration of the 19th century, did fade in the early 20th century. And whilst floral symbolism or florography didn't originate in the 19th century, the formalised lists perpetuated through the language of flowers as a cultural product, I think helped to establish floral meanings in the popular imagination. And there is a wealth of collectible material relating to the language of flowers, which includes, perhaps unsurprisingly, art, greetings cards, Valentine's cards particularly, and needlework. So just a bit about my own collection. It's very much a hands-on mini archive inspired by a graduate research seminar on defining an archive with Professor Sue Wiseman at Birkbeck. I've used these books to look up floral meanings with reference to their appearance in Gothic fictions that I'm working with for my PhD thesis. So whilst I can and do supplement these researches with the wealth of digitised material available, it's been a comfort to know that I can quickly turn to my own books to do some digging around. I'd also wanted a good look at a range of these books whilst libraries were closed, because the varying sizes, perhaps for practical transport into the garden, as well as the beautiful bindings and illustrations really come alive when handling the material object. So going forward with the collection, I'm going to take the advice of Justin Croft, who was on the interview panel for the book collecting prize, and I'm going to limit acquisitions, I think perhaps to those published in Britain, because there are so many out there. And I will aim to purchase, I think, the best quality copies possible within my budget, as I'd often been buying books that were not always in the best condition, let's say. So, decline and parody. People might wonder why I want to focus on these books, because they are criticised as a means of commodifying emotion and commercialising sentimentality, even instrumentalising flowers and plants as objects merely for adornment or use by humans, personifying flowers and having little to do with the real lives of the plants or serious botany. And their instability of floral meaning or sentiment across the 19th century have suggested to many that they were not used in a practical way to conduct a love affair or actually send messages, but they were merely used as decorative items of social status. However, I'll be honest, I love these books, as I think they are evidence of one prolific way that the Victorians thought about nature and human entanglements with nature. And they're not completely devoid of botanical information in many instances. They gesture as well towards a female community of readership and inheritance, rather than solely the love intrigues of genteel ladies and social climbing. So I'll share a few books from my collection now. This one is possibly my favourite. It's a second edition of Charlotte Delatour's Le Langage des Fleurs. The first edition was published in 1819. This was 1834. So while Charlotte Delatour didn't write the first Language of Flowers book, it was her format, style and interpretation that really set the craze off and was translated widely. So I'm grateful to have a second edition of that book. It's the most expensive item in my collection. It was £100 and it was a Christmas gift from my mum. And it appears that it had also been a Christmas gift previously as a poem from Saint Nick, and a gift note is pasted into the front of the book. The note and the poem are in Dutch, and luckily for me, I have a Dutch friend who looked into this for me and looked at the history of the family. And it turns out it was passed through 3 generations of the same family. And the poem, presumably composed by Anna to her daughter Nancy, emphasises that the flower album is a means of accessing the beauty of nature despite the winter season. Now flowers are sleeping outside. It considers the importance of inheritance with the promise of renewal and reuse. Already I delighted many a son with it. And it acts as a symbol of friendship to triumph over pain and sorrow and fill the heart with joy and peace. So it passed through the 3 generations, like I said, and I think its usage demonstrates a long-standing female prerogative, an inherited form promoting love of nature, rejuvenation, connection in dark times. So that traditional sphere of romance is displaced to represent a transgenerational female appreciation of nature and literature with a message of light in the darkness at its core. So this is the second book I wanted to show you. It's a very early translation of the Charlotte Delatour. I have a bit of a puzzle with it that I haven't figured out yet, because Beverly Seaton mentions that the first English translation of the Language of Flowers was made by Frederick Sherble, and it had a slightly different title to this, even though it's published in the same year. It was The Language of Flowers with Illustrated Poetry. So this book is an anonymous translation from 1834 with that different title you can see there. I think I need to get down to the British Library to compare copies and figure out what the differences were, because the Sherble translation is often cited as going through a heavy editing process to remove anything that could be considered indecorous or not appropriate for a genteel lady. But this book, when I've compared it to my second edition of Delatour, seems to keep in most of the contents. It even has some French poetry translated. Well, it's not translated, it's printed in French verbatim in the book. So this is one for me to try and figure out further down the line. I wanted to share this next book as it was one of my cheaper acquisitions. It cost about £10 on eBay. It shows how the books might have changed and developed from the 1850s and 1860s. It's fairly unassuming. It's largely just a vocabulary, so no illustrations or anecdotes in this book. It does have a nice introduction though, setting out the intended audience, the rules for using the Language of Flowers, and it suggests that the Language of Flowers is the electric telegraph of the heart. So it's very much a product of a specific time in the 19th century. And I've seen the Language of Flowers referred to as the social media of its day and the emojis of its day. And that idea of like rapid, succinct communication, symbolism, widely understood, can be seen as embodied in the kind of more listified books like this. The next one I wanted to show you was one of my first acquisitions, and it's a great example of the diminutive size of these books. If you can see me, I'm holding it up here. It's very small. So it's often said that these books were small to fit the delicate hand of a lady, but they were also gift books, so they were, presented delicately, beautifully. And despite many of these books being digitised, as I've said, by the British Library, the Biodiversity Heritage Library, and the Internet Archive, I think a good reason to get hold of a copy and get to grips with the tactile aspect is this kind of fluctuation in size and style. And you can also see in this publication the idea of innovation of meaning and creativity attributed particularly to female editors and compilers of these works by scholars like Molly Engelhardt and those at the Biodiversity Heritage Library. And it shows how these works might be considered imaginative play and enchanting, even when sticking to the sort of established format of a flower vocabulary. Okay, so I chose this next one because it demonstrates a continual preoccupation of the language of flowers with poetry, as well as incorporating staples such as the vocabulary, illustrations, the rules of use, and example bouquets. Some of the bouquets are incredible. I've listed some on the slide. I can't imagine assembling or receiving these, as they often highlight that the language of flowers was not all sweetness and light, but often bound up with rejection, discord, and apathy in many ways. You can see in one bouquet a Venus flytrap is included, and you also have poisonous plants in the language of flowers, like mandrake, foxglove, hemlock, and belladonna. And the range of vegetal inclusion was sometimes startling, with trees, fruits, vegetables, even dead leaves. That they meant sadness or melancholy most of the time. Potato often meant benevolence. Mushroom was suspicion. Pineapple, you are perfect. Watermelon, bulkiness. Cypress tree, mourning, and oak tree, hospitality, to give a few examples there. I wanted to share this next book. It's a book I've obtained since submitting my entry for the Anthony Davis Book Collecting Prize, but I've included it because it illustrates perfectly the criticism levied at the genre about personifying plants. It also shows how the language of flowers maybe had branched out from its initial concern of adult love affairs at its inception and became associated with different audiences, so children in this case, and a sort of adolescent or youthful pastime. And what, was it a precursor of the Flower Fairy books? One of the judges on the panel mentioned this, and I can definitely see echoes of that, but I don't know the answer. There had also been other shifts in the language of flowers across the century, so country-specific volumes, religious volumes, but this shows how the genre moved across different groups as things went on. A couple of extra acquisitions I've made since entering the prize as well include, on the left there, Arthur Freeling, Flowers, Their Use and Beauty in Language and Sentiment, and that includes some Linnaean botany, lots of reference to English poets in an attempt to establish a kind of British tradition, and some newspaper cuttings from a previous owner, which shows a possible investment in the idea of the language of flowers retained in the 20th century a bit. And on the right there, I've got a second edition of Robert Tyus's The Sentiment of Flowers, or Language of Flora. And that really shows an effort to both emulate de la Tour, even to the extent of including illustrations from a really accomplished botanical illustrator, James Andrews, as well as making edits for propriety and gentility for, and this is a quote, the fairest flowers of the British Isles. So, middle-class women, whilst establishing a British tradition in floriography. So to conclude, if we do prioritise the many negative criticisms levied at the language of flowers, I think it's still important to look at these books because they can help us reconsider the ways that our relationships with nature and behaviours and actions towards plants merit attention. They evidence ways that dialogues with the natural world have sprung up previously, and they might inspire us to become enchanted and make some positive change in the world, perhaps, if we think about interconnections. In a recent symposium for the Chicago Botanic Garden, scholar Anne Shataya considered how plants and flowers are presented to lovers of nature in current times, given the peril and loss in the biome, potentials around plant communication, plant intelligence and sentience, calling for new ways that represent plant life beyond an anthropocentric relationship to plants, which could give voice to plants. And part of this idea of reconstituting and reimagining the language of flowers is embodied in Shataya's words. But this should not be to forget or erase what the Victorians imagined and worked on. So, as scholar Nicola Bowen has noted, sentimental art and literature invites us sympathetically to share the emotional world of those distant from us in time and circumstance, to know more about what it means to be human ourselves. And I think that these books are worth notice and collecting as a means of perhaps re-enchanting, reimagining our relationship with flowers going forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jemma. That, apart from anything else, they're just beautiful. Your collection is wonderful. And it's very interesting to see that perspective of 19th century women's books. So I have now set the chat so that you can ask questions type questions in the chat to everybody, or you can click the raised hand button if you'd like to ask a question in person, or you can, if you want to be on the recording, you can unmute yourself to ask your question and switch your video on only if you're happy to be on the recording. I'm going to ask Isobel and Jemma to put their cameras on here, and we'll get you up onto the screen there. Brilliant. Thank you very much. So while we wait for some questions, I had a question for both of you. You're both in different ways looking at books written by or owned by women, but often now they have found their way into men's collections. And I wanted to ask you a bit more detail about how you go about identifying books, whether it's Isobel looking in the library catalogue or Jemma looking booksellers' catalogues. Isobel, do you want to start? You said a little bit about that at the beginning, but I don't know if you've got anything more to add.
Yes, so in terms of locating them in the catalogue, so as I mentioned, sort of thinking about specific search terms was very useful, given the issues with a lot of women writing under their married name or under their maiden name, and then they don't necessarily all come up when you search for the name that you expect it to be. And the fact that a lot of them on imprints at least, or on title pages, are listed as Mrs. surname or Miss surname. So even A for Ben was often on the title pages as Mrs. Ben. So those kinds of, I think thinking about different search terms is really helpful. I think as well, looking at, obviously a lot of these women's writing could have been anonymous. So in some cases, it's just looking at attribution later on. And so those kinds of writers might not necessarily come up as being the author or creator of a work, but they might be mentioned in a note field to say they were associated with this work in some way. I found as well with Eleanor James, because her work was, she wrote a lot of pamphlets and broadsides, so they're much smaller works, which were often then bound together into larger volumes, or they might be kept in completely different collections because they're not always considered as sort of book material. They're not always like bound, I mean. So yes, searching for her, you kind of have to sift through the variety of different works that are all bound into one volume. And then, yes, I found the Orlando database very useful, but obviously that is limited to the British Isles, but it does have links to lots of different women writers, and there's plenty more scope there for more research. And it also, interestingly, has tags for anyone associated with them. So Bridget Fremantle, for example, has a page on that website or on that database, even though she didn't actually write herself, but because she's associated with a writer, she's on there. So yeah, those kinds of databases. There's lots of databases as well for women's writing where they've put kind of a transcript of their writing or poetry onto a database. So there's like women's poetry databases and that kind of thing as well, which were very helpful for reading the actual texts of what they wrote.
Fantastic, thanks. And I know we've got someone in the audience who's been involved with databases of women's manuscripts from early modern, so perhaps we can have a chat about that in a minute. Over to you, Jemma. You're looking now at 19th century. How do you identify items? Where do you go to look for books?
So I've used something called, I think it's the 19th century index, and basically pulled lists off that, cross-referencing with the secondary kind of research, the contemporary research I've mentioned, you know, by Jack Goody and Beverly Seaton and Brent Elliott, because they talk about a lot of specific books as well. So I try and identify what they've looked at and then see what else is there. There are a lot of anonymous authors as well. And there's a scholar with the Chicago Botanic Gardens called Leora Siegel. And she mentioned in a symposium recently that anonymous authorship, she was attributing that to women, really. So yeah, and a lot of them have really similar titles too. So especially if you've got a lot of anonymous books with the same titles, I guess it's kind of a bit tricky, but that's how I've gone about it so far. So if you've got any suggestions for other methods, let me know.
But I think your method, Isobel, of looking for Miss or Mrs. is really interesting. I don't know if there's anyone out there in the audience who has any tips for searching catalogues for female authors when we don't at the moment have a gender tag for authors, and that's a controversial issue. I know that's being looked into for book cataloguing. Do type in the chat or just unmute if it's something that you've got any tips for. I have a question for either Isobel or the audience. Lucy Hutchinson, who was the potentially scandalous writer you mentioned. Now, quite a few of our copies of her work are in the Huguenot Society Library, which is looked after at UCL. Was Lucy Hutchinson a Huguenot, or does anybody out there who knows a bit about Lucy Hutchinson know what the connection might be there?
So I think that she was just very staunchly Anglican. She wrote quite a lot of religious writing, religious texts as well, particularly aimed at her daughters. So yes, I think she was just very religious, and that is quite a big part of her memoirs of her husband. And I should have mentioned actually that there's a slightly autobiographical fragment as well in some of the editions of her memoirs. So I think, yes, she really puts the Civil War into a kind of very sort of Christian perspective, and obviously she is on the side of her husband, which is why she's often just viewed as being a devoted wife. And I think people forget that actually she was writing about events that she lived through herself. And so she's not just writing about it as his wife, she's writing about it as someone who sort of was there. And I think it's a lot of these women actually really show that kind of beyond, I guess, the stereotype that women were just interested in the domestic sphere and the home and they weren't allowed to be involved in anything else. Actually, a lot of these women writers show that they were able to write about other things and they were able to engage beyond just the home and the church, and be involved in politics, even if they weren't actually able to go into Parliament or to vote themselves. Yes, but I did think that with her, I think the reason that she's in the Huguenot Library is probably because of this sort of religious background. And I think it's very similar actually. The Eleanor James pamphlet is also in the Huguenot Library. And again, that's a very religious text. And I think it's interesting that that is the only that's the only one of Eleanor James's works that I could find on the UCL catalogue as being a physical copy in Special Collections. And I don't know if that is because it was a religious work or because the other works were just not seen as being kind of worth collecting as being like of literary renown. As I mentioned, she doesn't seem to really want sort of merit from the writing.
That's really interesting. If anybody's interested in finding out more about the Huguenot Society Library, I've put the link to that in the chat. And those books are held at UCL Special Collections, so they can be consulted either in our Bloomsbury reading rooms or in the National Archives, where we also have a reading room. And if anybody in the audience comes up with any more information, that would be great, either on Lucy Hutchinson and Huguenots or on techniques for finding early modern women in the catalogue. Over to you, Jemma, now. We've got a question from Jacqueline, who says, I am intrigued by the tactile aspect and the size of the books. Are some of them in different formats? You showed us one very small one.
Yeah, I mean, they really do. Like, this is probably the smallest one I've got, and it's Mrs. L. Burke's The Miniature Language of Flowers. But this particular editor, and sorry, my fingers are terrible. This particular editor and compiler, she put 3 volumes together, and this is, I think, possibly the smallest and cheapest. The others were The Coloured Language of Flowers and The Illustrated Language of Flowers. So it would be good to look at copies of those. You've got here the Arthur Freeling book I mentioned. So it's a lot bigger, kind of differently bound. I guess the price is varied, but I've looked up prices a little bit, but I've got more work to do on that. And it's got a bit about classes and orders there. More, it carries on with the Linnaean botany. Not very many illustrations in that. So yeah, they varied like wildly, really. But I think they become briefer towards the end of the century. Something else that happened was birthday books.
Birthday books. Okay, so it's just Jackie wearing notes.
So I don't know if you're happy to tell me what day your birthday is, and I can tell you what flower you've got.
Okay, I can give you my daughter's. 26th of August.
26th of August, okay. Hang on. But yeah, so you basically get assigned a flower, a bit of poetry and a sentiment. So August the 26th, American Starwort, cheerfulness in old age.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And then a bit of poetry.
I'll have to get myself a copy and send it. Thank you.
So yeah, I hope that answered your question, kind of.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thanks ever so much, Jacqueline. That's great. I'm just at this stage, I'm looking at the clock, it's 2 o'clock. If you need to leave for work or other appointments, now's your chance. But we're going to continue with our discussion. We've got until 2:30. And I'm slightly springing this on her, but I'm going to ask Erika Delbecque, or if she's there, Ros Evans, who are two colleagues from UCL Library Services who've been involved in our Liberating the Collections project. We have this project here at Special Collections, as I described at the beginning, but we also have some other projects across the library services. For example, in the cataloguing and subject headings department, there's been quite a lot of publicity about bias in subject headings, and in a number of different areas. But I don't know if you're there, Erika, if you'd like to say something about the other strands of the Special Collections project that we haven't heard from.
I am here, yes. Yes, so there have been various strands in the within the project. I think the women's strand was the largest one, simply because it's even though it's as I think Isobel has illustrated, it's not always easy to find these women. It's easier and less problematic to find women authors than looking at areas like, say, LGBTQ authors, where you're projecting a later concept onto earlier authors, or disability, where we think there's just little in our collections, etc. So we have looked at, so I've mentioned LGBTQIA, we've looked at authors, and we've also looked at themes to do with that in the books. We've also looked at race and ethnicity. So we've looked at BAME authors and BAME printers and booksellers, which, as you can imagine, again, they're harder to find than women authors, and it takes you primarily into later centuries. But we have identified quite a few items in our collections. We've also looked at the theme of slavery in our collections, and then we've also looked at religions and minority religions in the collections. We have very large Jewish collections, and obviously we have lots of work to do with Christianity and its various forms. So we've looked at works outside of those traditions, and minority religions within religions, such as minority Jewish denominations, etc. We've identified works on as well. So that's all been kind of, the groundwork has been done now, and now we have to decide, or we have to make plans on how we are going to implement all of that new information that we found, and how we are going to take that to diversify the items that we use across the activities that we do, from cataloguing to digitization to teaching and learning to exhibitions, etc.
That's great. Thanks very much, Erika. So Erika Delbecque is our head of Rare-Books, and has been a fantastic support in expanding this project to become a volunteer project. And as I said earlier, look out on our blog for blog posts on those the results from those other strands. So do go ahead and put questions in the chat, or just unmute yourself. We're a small group now.
Yeah. Well, we wait for further questions. I actually had a question for both Jemma and Isobel, because it's quite nice to have you together in one session, because Jemma, you're a book collector, but you're also an academic, and Isobel, you're volunteering on this project, but you're also a librarian, so you're coming at this from different perspectives. But I was wondering, because you're both part of this journey of, reappreciating, rediscovering neglected authors or neglected genres of writing, and I was just wondering, in your experience, what can libraries do to help this process of rediscovery and reappreciation, because this material has been within libraries for centuries, and yet some of these things are only being rediscovered now. What role can libraries play within that whole process?
I was going to say, Isobel, do you want to go first? But I think probably what you're doing with the volunteering project the Anthony Davis Book Collecting Prize, perhaps keeping as much online as possible, even as we move out of kind of COVID and pandemic times, because that's the way of sort of opening up accessibility to a lot of this, isn't it? But Isobel's probably got more to say than me.
Well, the same thing really. Yes, I think this project is really brilliant for going through the catalogue. This is kind of, I think, what needs to be done is sort of go through the catalogue, find what is there, and figure out the challenges with searching for it as well, because obviously I'm coming at it as someone who's done a lot of research already and used library catalogues a lot, but other people coming to it might not have that background. And so I think being able to provide as much help for them as possible to be able to be successful in making those searches. Yeah, I think also doing things like this with the talks and the blog to advertise the things that are in the collections really helps to reach out to wider audiences beyond sort of the normal researchers. And also, I know there's been some work on subject headings and updating them. And I think it's something that you sort of talked about a bit, Tabitha, in terms of making sure that they are tagged as being women authors, or being something like that, that even if they don't have Mrs. in front of the name, it's kind of we can figure out who they were, and it can be tagged even if it's anonymous as well. So yes, work on those would make them, I think, more inclusive and also more sort of findable for researchers, and then hopefully as more and more people find out about them, the word will get out there through research publications as well. The other thing I was going to mention was I know with the women that I looked at particularly, there seems to be a kind of overlap between the print and the manuscript culture. So particularly Lucy Hutchinson, she had manuscript copies which are kept in other repositories. And so it might be interesting to look at the kind of how that has worked out across the country and across the world in terms of who has these books, who has the print, who has the manuscript, and dig into that sort of network about where these books have ended up, because that's another interesting element of women's book history, particularly.
We had an interesting chat between the three of us, didn't we, about whether archival elements that are found in books should be kept with the books or detached, because I know Jemma, for example, you've also got some wonderful annotations in your books. I just want to ask the researchers out there in the audience, would tagging authors as male or female or other genders or no gender, would that, no specified gender, would that be helpful? I haven't set up a poll for that, but just put a yes or a no in the chat. It means sometimes we'd be making decisions retrospectively, often without very much information, so there's some controversy. It wouldn't be possible to tag every record there. I don't know if anyone's got any views. Just put a yes or a no in the chat.
Hi.
Hi. So,
I wondered if I could interrupt for a second.
Please do. I'd like to introduce Professor Victoria Burke from the University of Ottawa, who is an absolute long-standing expert on early modern women writers in manuscript and print. And it's just such a privilege to have you here, Vicky.
Oh, thank you. I've enjoyed the talk so much. I just wanted to say a few things from my perspective of 17th century women's manuscripts. And I suppose I've always found it the biggest challenge to figure out, has a woman been involved in this manuscript? Has a woman not been involved? And so any libraries, like I know the Folger Shakespeare Library has made a lot of efforts to make their searching as gender sensitive as possible. And I've certainly had some good success working with the Folger Shakespeare Library catalog. And I suppose looking in particular for women poets and women writers of that type, using the Folger hosted Union catalog of first line poetry, that's just an incredible resource where it can bring up hits from printed resources of all types, from manuscripts not only hosted by the Folger, but often taken from other different catalogues of first-line poetry from really around the world. And another thing, as you were talking, that I was thinking of is I make great use of the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, their full text search, because of course there might not be an article on a woman warranting a full article, but in full text you can find all these connections between people and family members, and that's where if maybe you just have a last name, you might find some kind of network that you weren't expecting. So yeah, from my perspective, I guess, you know, someone who's working on manuscripts, I realize that there are so many print sources as well. Like the overlap is almost constant, especially 16th, 17th century. So there might be some hit in early English books online, text creation partnership texts. Sticking a phrase into EBO TCP can all of a sudden lead to, oh, that appeared in my manuscript, or oh, that's got some connection to a woman that I hadn't thought of. So, and I suppose my final thought was, as you were talking, I thought I've had great luck with Internet Archive, Hathi Trust, things like 19th century pedigrees of families. You know, who knew that there was an out of print 1910 pedigree of the Biscoe family that all of a sudden leads you to various family networks. So yeah, so in answer to Tabitha's question, like when a library catalog can tell us that it's, you know, a female compiler, female owner, that's just such an extra help. Although I do understand there are judgment calls to be made as that decision is being made by a cataloger. So thank you for two wonderful talks. It really made me think.
Oh, Vicky, thank you so much for that expertise. And Erika's put some links there in the chat. That's super helpful. And it also reminds us that this narrative is unfortunately still around, that in the early modern period, you have print and then you have manuscript and then that's suddenly replaced by print. This wasn't the case at all. You have a manuscript tradition running parallel with print. And as you said, Isobel, in some cases, you've got people who are working in manuscript and then only after their death were they printed. And as Vicky, as you were saying, the 19th century perspective of the collector and the transmission of these physical books is really important. We had some nice examples of that in last week's session when the talk on women owners traced back early modern titles in later editions or owned by 19th century women. That's just great. Thanks so much, Vicky. Vicky, if you're still there, are there any updates on the Predator project now? Do you know, are you still involved with that?
Oh, yeah, I'm involved with a project called the Perdita Project, and the project has come to an end kind of as a funded body. So we have a searchable database. We're sort of a finding aid for manuscripts compiled by women 1500 to 1700. So there's a free online version where you can stick in a woman's name and there may be a hit for a known compilation by that person. Although we didn't catalog individual letters. So that's sort of a huge other area of women's participation, that if it's not a compilation, it didn't fit our remit. So there's a kind of free searchable database. And if you Googled Perdita catalog, University of Warwick, Nottingham Trent, Frames version, then you would get our sort of skeletal database. But Adam Matthew, the subscription-based publisher, has also put together 150 of the manuscripts that we sort of located in digitized manuscript form. So you could kind of look at the pages, basically digitized from microfilm, if you were interested. So if anyone out there is interested in Sarah Cowper, most of her manuscripts you would know already. The Hertfordshire Archives has them digitized, but Adam Matthew makes them available. So yeah, so Tabitha's right. If you sort of like think of all the different possible angles you could take If you have a name, you've got so much to work with to try to find more materials associated by that person. And just as Isobel was saying about Hutchinson being so important in manuscript and print, the Oxford edition of Lucy Hutchinson is bringing together so much scholarship on that writer. And some of the volumes have been published already.
That's all just gold information, Vicky. Thank you. And I didn't know about the Adam Matthews. That's really, really interesting.
It's very expensive, but many research libraries do subscribe. So they have a lot of incredible printed and manuscript resources that the researchers can just get lost in for sure.
Thank you so much, especially because it's probably early in the morning for you.
That's okay. I'm awake. Such a great session.
Oh, thanks so much for joining us. That's just wonderful. So that's all really, really helpful. And that we're putting. Thank you. Erika's busy getting the links there in the chat while we speak, which is fantastic. Thank you. So Isobel in particular, I don't know if that's some of that, it might be helpful. So moving to Jemma to 19th century, we also, I think, and I don't know if they're still with us, we have in the audience some people from horticultural and botanical libraries. And we just wondered whether there are actually, so far as you've found, any links with the real biological life of flowers and the metaphorical meanings that you're looking at in your books.
Yeah, the answer is yes, especially in the earlier editions. So Charlotte de la Tour, and then the translations, Robert Tyus, Arthur Freeling, they all have some examples. I wrote a few down in case. And it's kind of basic botanical stuff, but it still informs the meaning or sentiment. So I kind of think it counts. So dandelion is oracle because of its opening and closing, acting as a barometer. Heliotrope is intoxication, or I love you because of it following the sun. Meadow saffron is my best days are past because of when it flowers in autumn. Wallflower is fidelity and misfortune because it grows on ruins and broken monuments, and it kind of shows loyalty, I suppose. Like that's the idea. Yeah, what else do I have? Myrtle, I wrote down, grows to the exclusion of all other plants, so it's the symbol of love. I need to go back to that one, but yeah. So I think there are plenty of examples of that. It's not completely arbitrary how the meanings are generated all the time. It's not pure whimsy, although it might not be a bad thing if it's pure whimsy. I'm not sure.
Yeah, absolutely. So do put comments in the chat if you're one of those people from the botanical garden libraries who are attending. But did you know yet, Jemma, what you would like to add to your collection? And what's your experience been of collecting as a woman in quite a male-dominated world still, the book collecting world?
Well, I feel, honestly, like I've sort of come to collecting through the studies. I doubt I'd have been doing this if it wasn't for the master's degree and the kind of focus it took. But it's been, everyone I've met so far has been really generous and helpful, sharing information, sharing best practice. As I mentioned with Justin Croft on the panel as well. The next items to go for maybe a book by Lizzie Deus called Flower Favourites, because there's a scholar of the Gothic called Roger Luckhurst, and in a book called Late Victorian Gothic Tales, he uses that in one of his references. So I'd quite like that one because it particularly fits with my my thesis, and then John Henry Ingram's Flora Symbolica, simply because Brent Elliott kind of says that he, particularly in the late sort of 1860s, instigated this phase the flower books went through where all previous meanings were kind of merged together, amalgamated, and it might have caused some of this kind of chaos in, with all the different meanings merged together. So I know you can see it online, but again, that's maybe the next one to collect for me.
That's very exciting. So we're drawing to a close now. I'd like to thank you both so much. We really have had a fantastic picture from early modern and the 19th century of some of these books, and an interesting idea in the discussion of really where the places of print with running parallel with manuscripts. And we saw in your talk, Jemma, those fantastic annotations that indicate that these books are part of female inheritance. And it's interesting, Isobel, for you, that we're looking at items that those 19th century, early 20th century collectors, for whatever reason, saw as significant enough. I think many of your books were in the library of Charles K. Ogden, who actually was collecting in the early 20th century. If you'd like to attend our session next week, we'll be looking at the conservation of some of those early modern manuscripts that Charles K. Ogden put together. His library was about communication and language, and it's a library very much equally of print and manuscripts, and usually bits of combined of both, and we'll see some examples of that next week. And in the meantime, thank you both very much. Thank you to Erika, thank you to Vicky, and thank you to all of the audience, and we look forward to seeing you at next week's session.